Welcome to the AA Podcast, our little corner of the web where we are not afraid to discuss tough questions like,
when did nutrition, health, movement, and stress management become alternative medicine?
Where we embrace challenges in all aspects of life to become healthier and stronger versions of ourselves.
And where food and movement are the best kinds of medicine, and cooking meals at home is a revolutionary act. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the AA Podcast. This is Ashley Olson.
And I'm Andrea Crane.
We're excited to have you once again for another episode. And today we are diving into a very controversial topic in the health and wellness division. And
you say diving in, I say wading in.
Well, we're going to do our best to, swim.
There you go. Yes,
just
sink or swim.
Just keep swimming.
Yep.
But before we do that, as always, we're going to share our weekly Bible verse with you. And mine is coming from James 1:12, and it says, "Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him."
Awesome. Okay, mine is the well-loved Ephesians 6:12. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood or
principalities,
Semaglutide or Tirzepatide, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this world's darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm.
Yes. Good
right.
Okay, so Andrea already kind of gave it away. We are diving into
I usually do.
Semaglutide and
Tirzepatide
and Manjaro, whatever name that you've probably seen thrown around out there.
Yes.
Ozempic, all the things. So we are going to break this out into 2 episodes. The first one, we're just going to do a overview of what these drugs are, how they work, how the body and why the body responds to them, all that good stuff. And then the next episode, we're going to dive into like, okay, if you are on these drugs or are looking at getting on these drugs, what things should you be aware of, and what are the positive and potentially negatives of these drugs on your body, either short-term, long-term? What can you do when you're on the drugs? All that jazz. So
what I'm hoping for these 2 episodes is that I think there's a lot of people out there that have questions about them, but they don't really know where to go for good answers. There's lots of stuff online, and you don't know who's telling the truth, who's got an ulterior motive. I just want us to be a source of sort of unbiased information about these things, and just kind of give people the real deal, the lowdown on what's this all about.
Absolutely. And obviously, a lot of these drugs, I don't know which one's the newest one necessarily, but these drugs have been around a while for diabetic people, but now they're coming on the market because they've shown effectiveness in the weight loss division. And so this is a whole new realm of using those drugs. So this is why it's kind of been there's probably not going to be a ton of information out there for a while on especially long-term positive or negative impacts on the body. So, we're gonna just like like Andrew says, we're gonna wade through all this. And I think we said it in a previous episode, or maybe it's just we've been talking about this episode for so long that this is just ingrained in us. But like there needs to be informed consent on when you take these drugs, and what any drug, I don't care what it is. I mean, you need to know the positive and negative impacts that it potentially could have on you. So I think where we should start today is just defining what these are. So we'll be tossing around, or Andrea I should say, we'll be tossing around some, acronyms, if you will, of what these drugs are. So where should we start, Andrea?
Well, so I would like to start just by giving, I guess, a super quick history lesson about GLP-1 agonists. So these drugs are called GLP-1 agonists, and I'll go into what that means here in a minute when we talk about how they work in the body. But for starters, they're the original OG GLP-1
What
drug.
is GLP-1? What is
Oh,
GLP?
well, GLP, you wanna get into that now?
Oh,
This is it's a glucagon-like peptide, and actually, I will get more into that with the mechanism of action because it
mhm,
kinda tells you what it does.
right.
Um but yeah, the OG drug was called liraglutide. So many people have probably never even heard of that one. It is not as popular as semaglutide or tirzepatide, but it was the original GLP-1. And these drugs were developed for type 2 people with type 2 diabetes, and that is where they have shown like this incredible positive impact, is in the treatment of type 2 diabetes. But as we know, type 2 diabetes is very much a disease of lifestyle. It's very much a disease of obesity and insulin resistance, and glucose metabolism. So, if you can harness that, then you've all of a sudden not only have you treated type 2 diabetes, but you have also beaten back obesity, and you have entered the realm of weight loss too, which is exactly what these drugs have done. So, um, for I guess just in terms of what they do in the body, let's just get into it. So liraglutide is the very first one, but then and we're not going to talk about that one because that one's really not even in the mix anymore. Now we're talking about semaglutide, which goes by the brand name Ozempic or Wegovy, and then there is also an oral formulation of semaglutide, and that is called Rybelsus. So, Ozempic, Wegovy, Rybelsus, those are all semaglutide, and this was the second GLP-1 agonist. Okay, so you had that first one that was kind of, a little bit of a flash in the pan, but it got this whole industry started because it was discovered that the mechanism of action of these drugs really works. And so semaglutide, what it does in the body, and I'm going to get to Manjaro or Tirzepatide here in a minute, but let's stick with semaglutide first. Most of the time, this is going to be an injectable form of the medication. I'm not sure. I've never prescribed the oral semaglutide, and but I do know that we have patients in clinic that are on it. Um, I don't know how well it works for weight loss or for type 2 diabetes, so I can't personally speak to that one, but I can definitely speak to the injectable form. Um, and so they all work the same, but what this is going to be, so basically when we have drugs, you may think that there are these super complex biochemical processes that drugs kind of weigh in on when they get into the body, and that's true. But by and large, we can kind of put most drugs, I'd say 90% of drugs, we can put into one of two categories. They're either going to be an antagonist or a blocker, or they're going to be an agonist. Okay, so I'll explain the difference. So, an antagonist or a blocker, that kind of tells you what it does, right? It goes in and it blocks something from happening. An agonist is just the opposite of that. It's going to go in and mimic something that's already in your body, but just do it better or for longer. Does that make sense? So
Mhm.
an agonist causes more of a natural reaction. A blocker will block that natural reaction. Okay. So these drugs are agonists. So they actually, your body is it already has GLP-1. You produce it. So this is glucagon like peptide. Okay. Now, when your body produces glucagon like peptide, this is produced by your small intestine, the far reaches of your small intestine, like right where it's going to turn into your large intestine or colon, that far distal end of the small intestine. When you eat food, your body, that distal end of the small intestine and the colon, it will release GLP-1. Okay. So this is the glucagon like peptide that gets released, and then that goes and it finds receptors in the pancreas, specifically in the beta cells. Now that should kind of jog your memory here, because beta cells are what releases insulin, and insulin is kind of what makes the world go round when we talk about metabolism and things like that. So we're going to tickle those beta cells with GLP-1. So it binds to those pancreatic beta cells, but it also binds to receptors in the gastric mucosa. So this is just like the mucus layer in your gut. Okay. So it also binds to receptors in the kidney and in the heart and in the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is important because it's involved in appetite and weight control. So these are all under the influence of the hypothalamus. So you can see the effects of GLP-1 are far reaching. But here's the thing, GLP-1 only lasts for like 1 to 2 minutes in the body. It has a very, very short half-life. So if you can think about it, it's a peptide or a protein, okay? Um, and it's got an end on it that is really, really attractive to these enzymes that come along and chew it up. So the enzymes find it within 1 to 2 minutes, and they chew off the end. And all of a sudden, your peptide doesn't work anymore because the end got chomped off. All right. So when we give it as a drug, it doesn't have that end that is so susceptible to being chomped by enzymes. Okay. So it'll hang around for a lot longer. Because if I give you, a $500 drug and it lasts for 1 to 2 minutes in the body and exerts 1 to 2 minutes of appetite suppressive effect, that's a pretty poor response. So we really need this thing to last for a little longer. Um, but so let's talk about what happens once the GLP-1 binds to its targets, right? We talked about targets in the pancreas, in the gut, in the kidney, the heart, the hypothalamus. So what happens is you get a spike in insulin, okay? And then there are other things that happen as well. I won't bore everyone with the details, but one of the big things is that you get a spike in insulin. Then you get a downstream effect. There are a couple of other things that happen. You get this slowing of gastric emptying. So I'm sure everybody knows this. When you eat, food sits in your stomach, right? And then it gets slowly released little by little into the small intestine. Now, we've probably all said at one time or another after eating some really nasty, like heavy, usually breakfast food, I find. And then you try and go do something physical, like get on a bike and ride or go run. And you say, oh my gosh, this food is just sitting in my stomach, right? Because you feel like it's literally this lead balloon in your stomach. Well, that is a case of slowed gastric emptying. All right. So if you demand something physically of your body and you've got this really heavy food sitting in your stomach, it will just kind of sit there because the body will be like, hey, we need to turn on our fight or flight mechanisms so that we can really innervate and get blood to all of our major skeletal muscle groups. So digestion is not the first thing on our mind right now. So
Mm.
it will kind of stop digestion at that point. But this drug does the same thing. It slows gastric emptying. So the effect of that is you get full faster and the appetite is suppressed because you have increased satiety. All right. So you get these, they're called gastric stretch receptors. So when your stomach gets stretched out, it sends a signal to the brain that says we're full, quit eating. Yeah. So does that make sense? Any questions so far?
No, that makes total sense.
Okay. So now we've got the body GLP-1, but then we've got the drug GLP-1, right? Now, it lasts for quite a long time in the body. So that is how semaglutide works. Then along comes another drug called tirzepatide. So tirzepatide along with the GLP-1 stuff that we just talked about, it also is an agonist of something called GIP, or glucose dependent insulinotropic peptide. So we'll just call it GIP. So this peptide also upregulates the secretion of insulin by those pancreatic beta cells. So we get this double whammy with Manjaro of an insulin spike. Okay. And then you also get all of the other appetite suppressant effects. You get increased satiety, you get decreased gastric emptying, and you can see where if somebody gets on this drug, and if you know somebody on them, no doubt you've heard of these horrible gastric side effects. And this happens not to everyone, but to certain people it does. I'd say the effect is quite common for them to be really nauseous or for them even to vomit. They also can feel bloated. They also can get heartburn. So all of these things that go along with poor digestion. And but that's exactly what the drug's doing. It's supposed to do that. And when
Mhm.
you're feeling that crummy, you don't want to eat anymore. And so you get this necessary calorie restriction because you just feel too nauseous to eat.
Yep, I do have, I know some people on this
Mm,
and
mhm.
the textbook what you just said.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've got the Manjaro and or the Tirzepatide and the Semaglutide, all right? So that's how these drugs work. Now, they're also what I wanted to talk about tonight also is there is a compulsive component to um people who are desirous of losing weight. Like they're, how many times, Ashley, have you had clients who say, I eat when I'm not hungry. I
Mhm.
get these munchies at night and I can't like it's like I have this compulsion that is so strong and I can't overcome it.
Yep.
And like all I think about is food. Like I'll save it as a reward. And then I think about it all day. So this is also what I've heard from people about these drugs is that it turns off that compulsive voice in their
Yep.
heads and
Mhm.
they are able to withstand the compulsion. It's like it's gone.
Yeah.
And that's what I've heard from people. Have you heard the same?
Oh, absolutely. People have literally said it just feels like a miracle. Like I
Mm-hmm.
before being on this drug, I constantly was thinking of my next meal, like, and
Mm-hmm.
then I couldn't even wait for my next meal. I was wanting something in between.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
and now they're like, I don't even remember if I ate today.
Yeah. Yeah. And so yeah, now this all sounds very amazing, and in fact, I also wanted to speak a little bit more to that compulsive nature of eating, right? Because we've all said it. Eating modification is hard. It's not like stopping smoking or stopping drinking or stopping doing a habit entirely, right? You cannot stop eating. It's not like this is a habit that you can just say, okay, I'm gonna put it down and I'm gonna walk away from it. You can't do that. You're exposed to food every single day. And so there's very much a compulsive nature. And this is why we have groups like Overeaters Anonymous, right? It's an offshoot of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it all has to do with compulsion and compulsive behavior. So there are two other medications that I have used and do use in practice to deal with binge eating. And so low dose naltrexone is one of the medications that I will use to if someone is really struggling with binge eating. I have also seen, I have not prescribed this myself, and I don't know that I would, but I have also seen Vyvanse used for compulsive eating. And so this does speak to that psychological component, right? Because naltrexone is very much a drug that affects the brain. We talk about it a lot in terms of inflammatory response and lowering overall inflammation, but it certainly affects the brain as well because it tickles those opiate receptors, right? And Vyvanse, very much a psych medication, and so helps with binge eating disorder. So yeah, just interesting that these GLP-1s, they've got this the mechanism of action is very much from the neck down, right? Like we don't think of these as neuro or psych drugs, but here they are taking away that voice, that compulsion, that is very much psych.
And would you I mean, would you say it's because of what is or isn't going into the gut, like that connection between the gut-brain
Hmm.
barrier?
That's a really, really good question. Because in fact, I used to lecture a lot on the gut-brain connection and just talk about the microbiome. I've been talking about the microbiome in classes for 10 years now, and I actually have papers that talk about that two-way communication line from the gut to the brain and back, and the signals or the messages that go back and forth between gut and brain, the messages from gut to brain outnumber brain to gut by 10 to 1.
Wow.
So the gut is speaking to the brain 10 times more often than the brain is speaking to the gut. Um,
Mhm.
and in fact, the gut is often called, the second brain or the
Mm.
hindbrain. So,
Yep.
yeah, that it very well could have something to do with that. Um, but yeah, there's this insulin piece to it also. And just I guess for the sake of there's one other thing that I wanted to talk about. It probably could fit into part 2 of this, but I'm gonna go ahead and mention it here, and then I think it will probably come up again in part 2. But when people are wondering about what they should eat when they do decide to take these medications, which we will go into all of that in our next episode. But for this one, I just wanna get it out there that I do not recommend that people go full-blown keto
Mm.
while they're on these drugs. I like for them to have some carbohydrate in their system, and I like for that blood glucose to be not elevated, but I like it to be at normal physiological levels. They have to have some dietary carbohydrate inputs, and here's the reason: because what we know about insulin is that it is anabolic, right? Insulin is anabolic. You need insulin to build muscle. It will stimulate muscle synthesis, right?
Mhm.
And so, yeah. So, what are you going to say?
Well, that's a big reason, like, when I have clients that were, one, we've gotten past the whole, like, um, basics of nutrition,
Mm-hmm.
and they are a resistance trained client, then I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
"Okay, I would like you to eat some simple complex or simple carbs around your, resistance
Around the
training,
workout.
with
Mm-hmm.
protein because that's going to stimulate that muscle synthesis."
That's right. That's exactly right. And so what you need to know about the mechanism of action of a GLP-1 is that yes, it does all of this magic, but it's in response to a hyperglycemic atmosphere, right? So you have to have adequate levels of blood glucose in order for this drug or your own GLP-1 to exhibit that insulinogenic effect. So, without the blood glucose, you don't get the insulin spike. Now, will you lose weight? Yes, you will.
Mhm.
Yes, you will. Why would we want insulin to go up? Because this will strip skeletal muscle from you so fast, and Ashley's going to talk about this in a lot greater detail on our next episode. But suffice it to say, there's a method to the madness. You need the insulin. Insulin is not the enemy. Insulin is a necessary mechanism in order to deal with blood glucose, but also it does so many other things. It functions as a hormone in the body, and it's got lots and lots of pathways that it works on, to include muscle building.
Absolutely. Yes.
So, yeah, did we cover all of the mechanistic things that we needed to cover?
I think so, yeah. I mean, it is interesting, like, the differences between the different drugs. So,
Mhm.
let's see, Mounjaro wasn't Mounjaro the one that is the latest FDA approved for weight
Yes.
loss? Yeah.
Well, yes, I say that, and gosh, I should have looked at this before
Well,
before
I did
we
it,
went
and
on.
it was in November, and it's
Yes,
Tirzepatide, but
yes,
the name
mhm.
is, trade name is
But there is
Mounjaro.
another one. There is another one that's coming. So,
Zepbound?
potentially. What's the generic on it? Does it say?
Um It
So,
says Tirzepatide, the active ingredient is Zepbound, is already approved under trade name Mounjaro.
okay,
Um,
okay, so that's just Tirzepatide. Yeah, and it will probably be, okay, so Wegovy is approved for weight loss, right? But it's just semaglutide. So semaglutide for diabetic use is called Ozempic. If it's used for weight loss, it's called Wegovy. All right. So it's got two brand names under which it's sold. Tirzepatide is going to be the same way. Manjaro for diabetic use, and then it looks like Zepbound for weight loss.
yeah.
But they've both been approved. Now, I will also say there is another one that's coming that apparently um, works better than these two also. And I don't know what the timeline is looking like on that. I think it's got to be fairly close to FDA approval. So keep your eyes on this space because we'll probably be seeing a third. Um, Oh, you know what? One final thing that we can talk about, speaking of availability of these medications, we can talk about cost
Yes.
because,
Yeah,
yeah,
and
go ahead.
certain insurance, is not
Hmm.
approving just for weight
That's
loss.
right.
Mhm.
That's right. And in fact, there are lots of insurances that are not covering it for type 2 diabetes either. And so I just want to dispel any myths out there that just because you would like to have, or even your provider would like you to have a certain medication, that doesn't mean that insurance has to cover it. They do not. And I will just put this out there. Now, I'm no fan of insurance companies. I fight them all day long. It's like the bane of my existence is to work in an insurance model, but that's where we are. So, however, that said, if all of the people that wanted or needed to take these medications actually did it, it would completely bankrupt the system.
Mhm.
Completely.
Mm.
And so there is a method, and
Well,
people are
yeah.
going to have to fund this themselves.
Yeah, and I know clients that were on a huge waiting list for a long time
Mm.
um to
Oh,
get on
because of
it
shortages?
because of shortages. And then I know,
Mhm.
like, I think you've mentioned it, but even people that were actually needing it for their diabetes,
Yeah,
like, weren't able to
right,
get it
can't
because
get
these
it.
people were
Yep,
getting it for weight loss.
right, that's exactly right.
Mhm.
Yeah, and and I was seeing all this happening like a year ago when there were these big shortages, and this was really a game changer for people that have type 2 diabetes. And type 2 is no joke. I mean, you will
Mhm.
lose your kidneys, you can lose your eyesight, you can lose
Phalanges.
limbs.
Yeah.
Yes, fingers,
Yes.
toes, legs. Like it's a big deal, and this is a big improvement. It's a big leap forward in terms of treatment options for people. And so it just made me kind of angry to see all of the people in Hollywood who were on these drugs to lose 10, 15 pounds.
Right.
And then here are these people who need it to preserve kidney function,
Mhm.
to preserve their eyesight, and they can't get it because there's such a shortage. And it's that kind of thing that it just kind of makes you cringe inside, like something is definitely wrong here. But yeah, we can talk more specifically about prices and things like that, and also availability on our next podcast, because I'm going to spill the tea on why these pharmacies are able to sell generic versions of this. Um, and these drugs just came out, right? They're still under patent. So why are pharmacies allowed to sell generic forms of these drugs? And I am going to tell you why that is.
Well, very awesome. Well, I hope that this kind of helped explain how these drugs work, why they work, and what they're yeah, what they're doing for both the diabetic individual, but also for those that are wanting to lose weight too.
Mhm.
And like Andrea said, we're going to dive deeper into more on, okay, if you decide to get on these drugs, all right, this is what you should know and what you can do
Mhm.
while you're on them. So look for that episode coming next week. But in the meantime, if you've enjoyed this episode or any of the other episodes that you have listened to, we would be honored if you would give us a subscribe for one, but then also to give us a 5-star rating, only 5 stars, please. And,
I love that.
and, then also the biggest compliment is if you shared this with your friends and family. So, we will wrap this one up and come back next week for the second part of this episode series.
Don't miss it.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The content provided in the Double A podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only. The podcast is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical advice.